Crown Prince is responsible for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. As President Trump and Congress threaten a partial government shutdown over the border wall, we explain what taxpayers are exactly being asked to buy. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. President Trump is sticking to his story tonight that he did not break the law regarding hush money payments to women threatening to go public about alleged affairs. The president telling Fox News today the prosecution of his former attorney, Michael Cohen, is just designed to make him look bad. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts starts us off tonight, as he often does, on the North Lawn. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening to you. A lot of talk in Washington today about whether or not the president faces increasing legal exposure after the Michael Cohen sentencing yesterday. But according to President Trump, Cohen is the sort of person who would say anything, even if it's a lie, to try to save his hide. President Trump broke his self-imposed silence yesterday on the Cohen sentencing on Twitter, and in an interview with Harris Faulkner today, the president insisting he did nothing wrong.
Let me tell you, I never directed him to do anything wrong. Whatever he did on his own. He's a lawyer. A lawyer who represents a client is supposed to do the right thing. That's why you pay them a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera.
President Trump also said that the payments made to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal were not illegal, despite what the Southern District of New York prosecutors said, or what Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to, or what media company AMI admitted it did.
If it were even a campaign contribution, it's totally legal. You look at stories one after another, they're all legal. The great lawyers that do that stuff are saying there's nothing illegal.
The president does get backup from a former member of the Federal Election Commission. In an op-ed in the Heritage Foundation's Daily Signal, Hans von Spakovsky wrote that the payments were a private transaction, not subject to campaign finance laws.
That had nothing to do with the campaign, weren't dependent on the campaign, and therefore there was no violation of federal law when these payments were made.
Spakovsky's argument centers on a statute that states campaign expenses do not include payments used to fulfill any commitment, obligation, or expense of a person that would exist irrespective of the candidate's election campaign. In other words, Spakovsky claims Daniels and McDougal likely would have come forward regardless of whether Donald Trump was running for president.
The whole question comes down to whether hush money payments made to these women, whether that's a campaign-related expense as opposed to a personal expense. And it's very clear from prior actions of the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission that this is not a campaign-related expense.
President Trump told Fox News Cohen only pled guilty because prosecutors were trying to embarrass him.
What he did is he made a deal to embarrass me. In order to embarrass me, they cut his term down. Pretty terrible stuff.
And he played down Cohen's significance in the Trump organization, saying he only hired Cohen after Cohen supported his bid to build Trump World Tower in New York at a condominium committee meeting.
He did very low-level work.
Why did you need him?
He did more public relations than he did law. He was on a committee, and he was so responsive and so good. And I said, he's a nice guy. I shouldn't have done it.
And there may be another investigation looming. The Wall Street Journal reports today that federal prosecutors in New York City are looking into spending by the Trump inaugural committee. According to the Journal, the prosecutors want to know if some of that money was misspent and whether donors were giving a lot of money to try to buy influence with the incoming administration. Brett?
We'll unpack all of that on the panel. John, thanks. We're awaiting new information about the special counsel from the special counsel about a federal interview without a lawyer present of a key figure in the Russia collusion investigation. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge fills us in tonight.
Filed late Wednesday night, the order from federal judge Emmett Sullivan gives special counsel Robert Mueller's team less than 48 hours to provide all records and underlying notes from the FBI's January 2017 interview of former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn in the White House Situation Room. In court papers this week, Flynn's attorneys claimed then FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, later fired for lying to federal investigators over media leaks, called Flynn at short notice, then sent two agents, including Peter Strzok, who sent anti-Trump texts to conduct Flynn's Russia interview. The filing also claims McCabe discouraged Flynn from having a lawyer present, and the agents did not warn Flynn that any false statements could be prosecuted. By contrast, Flynn's legal team said other witnesses were warned of the probe's serious nature. Over the weekend, Comey said he was directly involved because he believed Flynn's statements about his Russia contacts to the vice president conflicted with FBI evidence.
I sent them. Something I probably wouldn't have done or maybe gotten away with in a more organized investigation, a more organized administration, in the George W. Bush administration, for example, or the Obama administration.
Adding to the mystery, last year Comey and McCabe told Republican House investigators that the FBI agents reported no signs of deception from the Flynn interview. Despite the guilty plea, the president, who rarely comments about Flynn, told Fox he believes his former aide was pressured.
They convinced him he did lie, and he made some kind of a deal. And now they're recommending no time. You know why? Because they're embarrassed that they got caught.
Judge Sullivan has a track record for calling out prosecutorial misconduct. His order puts a special counsel in Flynn's legal team on a tight timeline. The sentencing, Brett, is scheduled for Tuesday.
Another development today, Catherine. Alleged Russian spy Maria Butina, she entered a guilty plea to conspiracy charges today. We found out a little bit more, but what can you tell us about all of it?
Well, this morning, Maria Butina pled guilty to one charge of conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign country. The federal judge found Butina understood the nature of the charges against her and was acting of her own free will when she entered the plea. Prosecutors claim Butina used her contacts with the National Rifle Association to develop relationships with politicians and gather intelligence for Russia. Butina faces a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison, and it's important to note her case is separate from the Mueller probe, Brett.
Thanks, Catherine.
You're welcome.
The Senate is making its harshest statement yet against the leadership of Saudi Arabia. Senators are pointing the finger of blame for the death of the Saudi journalist directly at the Crown Prince and trying to end U.S. involvement in the Yemen civil war. Correspondent Peter Ducey is live on Capitol Hill tonight with the latest. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Brett. Tonight, the Congress condemned the kingdom after classified intelligence briefings from top administration officials showed that the Crown Prince may have had his fingerprints on plans to kill a journalist.
What are you hoping that lawmakers take away from today's briefing?
The defense secretary did his talking in a classified setting, but Democrats were not satisfied with his presentation about the death of Jamal Khashoggi.
I could have spent the time watching the cable news and learned more.
The Trump administration is trying to keep Congress from jeopardizing ties to a strategic ally.
They made the point very strongly of the importance of our relationship with Saudi Arabia.
But the Senate stung Saudi Arabia anyway. First, approving a measure that pulls U.S. support for fighters in Yemen's civil war who also side with Saudi Arabia.
We will not continue to have our military posture dictated by a despotic, murderous regime.
The United Nations is trying to ensure a truce in Yemen, too.
We have reached an agreement on Hodeidah port and city, the establishment of a governorate-wide ceasefire.
That's as some defense-minded senators preview sanctions against Saudi Arabia, which could have so much support they couldn't be vetoed.
I don't like this approach. I'm sympathetic to the cause. But next year, I think Menendez and Young and Graham and others will come together on a bipartisan bill that will get a veto-proof majority.
The Senate decided to go on the record today with a resolution that says the Senate believes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
It's a clear and unambiguous message about how we feel about what happened to this journalist.
For many lawmakers, this resolution was a long time coming. For its sponsor, Bob Corker, it also took a long time to bring up.
Hey, we were going to have 10-minute votes, okay? We've had 2 votes in 54 minutes. Can we not just vote? Okay?
The Trump administration is still leaving open the possibility that maybe the Crown Prince was not responsible for the journalist's murder, but lawmakers who saw the same intel decided anyway that they were going to flex their muscle as a separate but equal branch of government, and they are promising more pressure on Saudi Arabia in the new year. Brett.
Peter Ducey live on the Hill. Peter, thanks. The House and Senate have passed a bill to overhaul the process for handling sexual assault and harassment claims in Congress. The bill holds lawmakers, including those who leave office, financially liable for settlements resulting from harassment and retaliation. It also eliminates mandatory counseling and mediation for victims and gets rid of a cooling off period they are now required to observe before filing a lawsuit or requesting an administrative hearing. The legislation now heads to President Trump, who is expected to sign it. The American public is not sold on congressional leadership. That's not a surprise, but it is the conclusion of the latest Fox News poll. Registered voters disapprove of House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, and soon-to-be top Republican in the House Kevin McCarthy. You can see the numbers there. McConnell does better among Republican registered voters and is up 9 points since August. Pelosi gets stronger marks from Democrat registered voters. She's up 11 since August. The clock is ticking and tempers are flaring tonight over the president's demand for a border wall. But is it a fence or a wall? And will a fight over semantics shut down the government, even partially? Here's national correspondent William Lajeunesse.
We need a wall in certain parts. No, not in all parts, but in certain parts of a 2,000-mile border, we need a wall.
What the president means by wall is confusing and part of the problem.
We think the wall is a bad strategy.
In fact, many sections of the border are already lined by more than 100 miles of steel bollard-style fencing, or what Trump calls a wall.
Our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more.
Since the 1990s, lawmakers from both parties approved and built some 650 miles of border fence of various designs. Congress approved 700 miles of double fencing in 2006, with a majority of Senate Democrats, including Schumer, Clinton, Biden, and Obama, voting for it.
The bill before us will certainly do some good. It will authorize some badly needed funding for better fences.
President Trump so far replaced 31 miles of barrier.
So we've started the wall, $1.6 billion.
That money will pay for an additional 93 miles, but the president wants more.
If we got $5 billion, we could do a tremendous chunk of wall.
We're not going for the $5 billion for the wall. We simply are not.
$5 billion will buy another 215 miles in San Diego, El Centro, Yuma, El Paso, Laredo, and the Rio Grande Valley, unless Congress objects.
There's no moral difference between a fence and a wall, so it makes no sense. The only argument to deny Trump the wall is because they hate Trump.
So far, the White House has not clarified if that new money would be used to replace old fence or extend the existing fence, or how much of the $5 billion pays for more manpower, judges, sensors, cameras, drones, which are likely part of the border security negotiation. Brett?
William Lajeunesse in L.A. William, thanks. Businesses and schools across the U.S. were evacuated today because of a bomb threat hoax. Officials in Atlanta, New Orleans, and Anchorage, Alaska say businesses received emailed bomb threats that were part of what they believe was a nationwide hoax. The FBI released a statement late today saying, quote, "We are aware of the recent bomb threats made in cities around the country, and we remain in touch with our law enforcement partners to provide assistance. As always, we encourage the public to remain vigilant and to promptly report suspicious activities which could represent a threat to public safety." There are new concerns tonight about Iran's efforts to get personal information about top American officials in retaliation for increased sanctions on that country. Correspondent Ellison Barber tells us what we're learning tonight.
As President Trump moved to end the Iran nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions, hackers said to have ties to Iran allegedly tried to break into the personal emails of American officials responsible for enforcing those sanctions. That, according to an exclusive report by the Associated Press. The U.S. government has focused on Iran and cyber activity for decades, but experts say this recent hacking attempt could be an escalation of a long-standing problem.
It's hard to put this in context without knowing what their end motivation is. Is it espionage, which, you know, they have a long history of doing, or is it in this second category of using cyber to conduct destructive attacks?
Andrew Grotto's email was reportedly one of the targets. He worked as the senior director for cybersecurity policy under both President Obama and President Trump. The hackers are said to be part of a group known as Charming Kitten.
They're known for being a little sloppy and a little loud.
One of the group's hit list reportedly became public after the hackers accidentally left a server open to the internet. A London-based cybersecurity firm extracted a list of 77 addresses and turned them over to the AP. The AP says the list includes private accounts of high-profile defenders, detractors, and enforcers of the nuclear deal struck between Washington and Tehran, and more than a dozen U.S. Treasury officials. The Department of Treasury wouldn't get into specifics, but a spokesperson told Fox News Homeland Security issued an alert on November 1st to private industries related to the Iranian sanctions. And the spokesperson says by default, that security alert applied to federal agencies, including the Department of Treasury. Brett?
Ellison, thank you. Up next, how a Republican candidate for Congress got the most votes in the midterm election and still lost. We'll explain. First, what some of our Fox affiliates around the sex in the U.S. Government attorneys called it a case of modern-day sex slavery. Defense attorneys contend the women were willful participants. Officials say this is the largest sex trafficking ring ever dismantled by the federal government. Fox 7 in Austin, Texas, as Apple announces it will build a $1 billion campus in Austin. The tech giant says the new facility will open with 5,000 positions, but it will have the capacity to eventually accommodate 15,000 new employees in fields ranging from engineering to research and development to sales and support. And this is a live look at Los Angeles from Fox 11, our affiliate there. One of the big stories there tonight, California regulators are considering a plan to charge a fee for text messaging. Virgin Galactic's tourism spaceship climbed more than 50 miles high above California's Mojave Desert today, reaching for the first time what the company considers the boundary of space. The ship reached an altitude of 51 miles before beginning its gliding descent and a safe landing on a runway. The flight takes Virgin Atlantic a big step closer to turning the goal of commercial space tourism into reality. The company aims to take paying customers on the 6-passenger rocket, which is about the size of an executive jet. More than 600 people have committed up to $250,000 already for rides that include several minutes of weightlessness and a view of the Earth far below. Back here on Earth, the Democrat who won a controversial race for Congress in Maine says a judge's ruling dismissing a Republican challenge is a vindication. The controversy involves Maine's system of determining a victor, a system that turned the GOP candidate from a winner to a loser. We get details tonight from correspondent Douglas Kennedy.
So after Election Day, you had more than 2,000 more votes than your closest opponent.
That's correct. I won on Election Day.
Republican Congressman Bruce Poliquin was the first choice of more voters in his bid for re-election in Maine's 2nd House District. Unfortunately for you, you were not their second choice.
This is the craziest thing I've ever seen.
Crazy, he says, because his Democratic opponent has been declared the winner. And on Thursday morning, U.S. District Court Judge Lance Walker threw out his lawsuit challenging that result. Poliquin's loss is the first test of Maine's new election tabulation process called ranked choice voting, where voters can prioritize a crowded field of candidates from favorite to least favorite. If no candidate wins a majority, as happened with Poliquin, they eliminate the last place finisher and take his or her second choice picks and distribute them among the remaining candidates. That process is then repeated until someone gets over 50% of the vote. Adam Friedman is pushing a ranked choice voting proposal in Massachusetts.
With ranked choice voting, you actually get to vote honestly rather than strategically.
Friedman explains in crowded fields like the 2016 Republican presidential primary and the promised 2020 Democratic primary, a candidate can easily win with less than 40% of the vote. He says voters often won't vote for the candidate they like the best because they're afraid the candidate they like the least may be elected. But what about Congressman Poliquin? He got the most first-choice votes, but then ends up losing. Is that fair?
It actually is fair because ranked choice voting ensures that the winner has the majority of the district's support.
So supporters of ranked choice voting say what happened to you was fair because you were not the consensus candidate and didn't get half the votes.
For 200 years in the state of Maine, we've had one person have one vote. It's not complicated. It's not controversial.
In Washington, D.C., Douglas Kennedy, Fox News.
Up next, China ratchets up pressure on Canada in its three-way tech dispute with the U.S. First, beyond our borders tonight, a Paris prosecutor says a man killed in a shootout with police in Strasbourg is the main suspect in the Christmas market killings. Another official says the suspect opened fire on police and officers fired back, killing him. believed to be an Islamic extremist. 3 people died and 13 were injured in Tuesday's attack, which is being claimed by ISIS spy agency. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs is denying that the country was responsible for that hack. Stocks were mixed today. The Dow gained 70. The S&P 500 was off a half. The Nasdaq lost 28. China is increasing pressure on Canada tonight in its 3-way tech dispute that includes the U.S. Susan Lee of the Fox Business Network joins us from New York with the latest. Good evening, Susan.
Good evening, Brett. A second Canadian has been arrested in China.
According to the information I have, Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spaver are suspected of engaging in activities that endanger the national security of People's Republic of China.
Spaver and Kovrig both being detained on Monday and both having professional ties to North Korea. Spaver pictured here in 2014 with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and the former professional basketball player Dennis Rodman. The arrests taking place just days after China threatened severe consequences if Canada did not release Huawei CFO. Meng Wanzhou was released on bail this week, now awaiting trial for extradition to the U.S. She is accused of fraud to evade Iran sanctions. The arrest of Huawei's executive had global investors concerned that the event would strain U.S.-China trade talks, but instead we've seen positive developments. According to the Wall Street Journal, China is considering allowing more access for foreign firms and plans to alter a contentious high-tech push called Made in China 2025, a key demand from the White House. And President Trump today is taking credit for his hardline stance.
I have great respect for President Xi. He's not a capitulator, but I will tell you this. China's economy, if it's in trouble, it's only in trouble because of me. Nobody ever went to China and said, listen, you're stealing our intellectual property. You're doing all sorts of things that are wrong.
China is also following through on its promises to buy more U.S. goods, with over $500 million worth in soybeans being purchased. That, along with reductions in tariffs on U.S.-made cars and more money being spent on U.S. energy in the future, has been encouraging for the markets as we face that March 1st deadline to get a deal between the world's 2 largest economies. Brett?
Susan, thank you. The Trump administration is making some major changes to its policy in Africa. And some of those changes have to do with countering what is being characterized as a growing threat from China and Russia. Correspondent Jillian Turner explains.
The Trump administration's new Africa strategy is called Prosper Africa. Administration officials say it's a direct rebuke of President Trump's critics, who allege he's ignored the continent and point to disparaging comments he's made about African countries. First up on the agenda, countering the booming economic and political influence of 2 U.S. competitors in the region, China and Russia. Bolton roundly condemned China's trade and investment practices in Africa, labeling them predatory.
China uses bribes, opaque agreements, and the strategic use of debt to hold states in Africa captive to Beijing's wishes and demands. Its investment ventures are riddled with corruption and do not meet the same environmental or ethical standards as U.S. developmental programs.
He said both countries flout international laws in order to curry favor with Africa's elites, but he reserved his harshest critique for the Putin regime.
It continues to sell arms and energy in exchange for votes at the United Nations, votes that keep strong men in power, undermine peace and security, and run counter to the best interest of the African people.
National security officials tell Fox News President Trump's vision is a two-way street. He wants to push African leaders to start choosing U.S. investment over Russian and Chinese deals. But he also wants the U.S. private sector to choose Africa. And as with all Trump initiatives, experts say it's a dramatic departure.
It was really the hallmark of the Obama administration to talk about African solutions to African problems. And the African Union was a big part of that. And Ambassador Bolton really didn't emphasize that at all.
But U.S. aid to Africa isn't drying up. Earlier this week, Secretary Pompeo committed $550 million to Senegal, one of West Africa's fastest-growing economies. This is a move the administration says is a continuation of Bush and Obama.
Criminal charges. They're not criminal. So what happened is either Cohn or the prosecutors, in order to embarrass me, said, listen, I'm making this deal for reduced time and everything else. Do me a favor, put these 2 charges on. They're not criminal charges. And they weren't for President Obama either.
Talking about campaign finance violations there. We'll get into that in just a bit. But the breaking news is the Wall Street Journal reporting tonight, and that is that Trump inauguration spending under criminal investigation by federal prosecutors. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan are investigating whether President Trump's 2017 inaugural committee misspent some of the record $107 million it raised from donations. The criminal probe by the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, which is in its early stages, also is examining whether some of the committee's top donors gave money in exchange for access to the incoming Trump administration, policy concessions, or to influence official administration positions. Sarah Sanders just answered a question on this.
On the inaugural committee, that doesn't have anything to do with the president or the first lady. The biggest thing the president did in his engagement in the inauguration was to come here and raise his hand and take the oath of office. The president was focused on the transition during that time and not on any of the planning for the.
That's from the White House tonight. So let's start there. We'll bring in our panel, Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Eli Lake, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, and Tom Bevan, Real Clear Politics co-founder and president. Okay, Judge, let's start inauguration committee. Listen, these things are often how do you say, a little slimy. There's done a lot of accounting about how money goes through inauguration committees. I mean, people get tickets. There's all kinds of money flowing around. This one had $107 million, and there's allegations now apparently being investigated.
Well, they're also often removed from the president-elect himself. And it is not uncommon for people to make contributions expecting a photograph. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and that's not what the U.S. Attorney is looking for. But if there were decisions made by officials in the White House, the president or anyone under him, as a quid pro quo for some of these enormous contributions, that's apparently what they're looking at. Look, this started in April when the U.S. attorneys in Manhattan, the same ones that were present in the courtroom yesterday when Michael Cohen was sentenced, raided Michael Cohen's office, home, and hotel room at the same time. That office was a couple doors down from Donald Trump's when he ran the Trump Organization. They probably discovered some documents in there that reflected what they believe are a quid pro quo. Michael Cohen's MO has been, you want access to the president, pay me and I'll get it for you. I'm not suggesting that the payments went